Hi there. This review discussion is going to largely correspond with a slide from your notes titled Chapter 15 Key Concepts. I understand that some people pull notes into Notability at different times, and so that changes slide numbers, but we're talking around slide 285. And if you were to access the Google Slides today, then we're definitely talking right around slide 285 there. As you know, our quiz for this chapter on interest groups is one argument style free response question. There is an in-depth video talking about argument style FRQ structure in Schoology. I've assigned the watching of that video quite a few times this year, and we've taken argument style FRQs quite a few times this year. As a reminder, in an argument style FRQ, you are given a prompt. You are then tasked with writing a defensible thesis. You then have to use one piece of evidence provided to you to support your thesis. Then you need to choose a second piece of evidence from any concept that we've learned in class, any of our required documents, any of our required Supreme Court cases, and use that second piece of evidence to support your thesis. For both of your pieces of evidence, you need to not just explain what that evidence is or what the main point of that evidence is, but also how that evidence relates back to your thesis. So the use of each piece of evidence is kind of two parts. What is this piece of evidence? How does this piece of evidence work to relate to my thesis? Lastly, then, you need to write a refutation, rebuttal, or concession. A refutation or rebuttal are pretty much synonymous with one another. For the most part, it's stating the opposing claim and then giving a reason why they are incorrect. A concession would be stating the opposing claim and then admitting to why they're right or why that one facet of their argument is right. If you are looking for a more in-depth conversation about writing an argument style FRQ, I highly recommend you check out the video that is linked in multiple places in Schoology. It's been assigned for you to watch multiple times. It's in this week's folder as well. Tomorrow, your quiz is one argument style free response question dealing with the topic of interest groups, because that's what Chapter 15 is all about. To be successful on an argument style FRQ, you have to be familiar with our required documents. Every single required document for AP Government we have covered already this school year. The previous slides, so for me, what I'm looking at right now is slide 284 in the notes. That the previous slide to our Chapter 15 Key Concepts review slide lists all of our required documents. In Schoology, there's also a link in this week's Schoology folder, there's a link to a required document review discussion. You need to be familiar enough with those required documents so that you can use them as evidence in an argument FRQ. One piece of evidence you get to choose, but one piece of evidence has to come from the list provided. So you want to be familiar with all of those different required documents. Like I've said, we have learned all of them this year. They are all throughout our notes, and in this week's Schoology folder, there is a review discussion going over the main point of every single one of those required documents. So structure-wise, I think we're all set with the argument FRQ. If we refocus our attention back on the Chapter 15 key concepts, allow me to go through that quickly as I would if I were in person in class. So an interest group is a group that is seeking to shape policy, and that's a nice broad definition that encompasses so many different types of groups, ranging perhaps from a parent-teacher association all the way to the National Rifle Association. We just this week talked about social movements, and the kind of tie-in with social movements and interest groups. Social movements often bolster the purposive incentives associated with any interest group. Whenever we see a social movement, we see increased membership in interest groups that are focused on that topic. During the environmentalist movement, there's an increase in the number of environmentalist interest groups and an increase in membership in those groups. We spent a bit of time this chapter, and for good reason, going back over some chapter 1 theories of democracy, we live in a federal republic. We elect officials to make decisions on our behalf. Those elected officials are going to be responsive to the majority of the people. And even more than that, the majority of the people that have the potential to threaten their job. And we've been describing that group as the political elite. There are different theories as to who that group really is, though. Who is the government being most responsive to? And we broke it down into 2 distinct theories. The pluralist theory is the theory that competing interests and diversity of those interests shape policy. The pluralist theory definitely acknowledges winners and losers. It's not so optimistic that it argues that we're all happy all of the time, but the pluralist theory would be optimistic in that it's not always the same winners and losers, that a debate over policy amongst diverse groups is what shapes policy. And so we see diverse outcomes, that there's lots of input from lots of people shaping policy. The elitist theory is just that. It's this theory that there's a very elite group and that group is not very accessible to the average person, and that's really who is shaping policy. So in that way, it's a little bit less optimistic because this group is less accessible. It's maybe even less diverse in a lot of ways, and this very small group is the one really wielding the power, is the argument in the elitist theory. Policy agenda, just moving on down the list here. Policy agenda is are the topics that the government is focused on. What types of topics is the government legislating on in that moment in time? Collective action is when a group works together to achieve something, and collective good is what they're trying to achieve. And we said that interest groups are going to do work whether one individual member joins or not, and that leads to the free rider problem. We will benefit from the action of an interest group that's doing something that we believe in, whether we as one specific individual join or not. And so all interest groups deal with that problem to a certain extent. One way that membership interest groups try to remedy that is through selective benefits, also known as incentives. I tend to use the word incentives, you may have noticed, but those are synonymous with one another, selective benefits and incentives. We spent a lot of time talking about incentives because you can make a lot of predictions about an interest group based on the types of incentives that it offers. We talked about purposive incentives, this sense of satisfaction that comes from serving a cause, material incentives, something that can be valued in terms of money, and then I got an email and it took my attention away. I apologize. Purposive incentives, material incentives, and we talked about solidary incentives as well. Solidary incentives, this sense of social rewards and camaraderie that comes from joining a cause. Remember, please, that the main goal of an interest group is not to attract members. That's not the end all be all of an interest group. Some interest groups use a large membership to influence policy, in their quest to influence policy. But please don't ever say that the goal of every interest group is to try to gain membership. No, the goal of every interest group is to shape policy. Some interest groups use a large membership to reach that end goal. Next on our list are all sorts of different types of interest groups, and I'm looking back in our notes here, trying to find the exact slide number for you to reference because there's a nice slide with all sorts of definitions. Here it is. On my notes, it's slide 230. An economic interest group is a group advocating on behalf of the financial interests of their members. Public interest group is a group that thinks that it's doing work for the collective good. You might not agree with them. You might actually not be in favor of their cause, but they think that they're pushing for policies that are to the greater good. Single issue group is a group focused on one issue. A government interest group is an interest group that's representing other facets of government. There's an interest group that speaks on behalf of the 8 largest cities in the country, for example. So around slide 230 is where you'll find those different types of interest groups. And forgive me while I'm toggling back now to our review slide. Okay, here we go. Lobbying is contacting government officials in order to try to shape policy. Direct lobbying, legislative lobbying would be if a member of an interest group is trying to speak directly to a member of Congress, the people that are actually drafting bills and trying to create laws. Some interest groups also lobby the executive branch by lobbying different bureaucratic agencies. The Food and Drug Administration, for example, has a lot of discretionary authority, and Pfizer, a drug maker, will often lobby the Food and Drug Administration to try to get the types of policies that they would like to see coming out of the Food and Drug Administration. We've also talked about lobbying the judicial branch, and if we look down a couple of bullet points, that's largely done through amicus curiae brief writing, friends of the court writing letters to the court. The revolving door refers to the fact that people that have worked within government become very valuable to interest groups or to corporations that lobby as well. They have that insider knowledge. And revolving door refers to this idea that throughout some people's careers, over the course of 30, 40 years, they'll work for government, then they'll work as a lobbyist, and then maybe they'll come back to government, and then maybe they'll go back to being a lobbyist. That doesn't always have to mean they're an elected official. In fact, I don't think that people are revolving in and out of being an elected official, even if they are an elected official for a time. This could be being an elected official, going into the private sector, coming back and being a member of a bureaucratic agency, for example. Okay. Already talked about amicus curiae briefs. An iron triangle in this context is the relationship between an interest group, a congressional committee, and a bureaucratic agency, and how that relationship works to shape policy. An iron triangle is in some ways considered a little bit outdated, or if we were to only focus on those three groups, that might be considered a little bit outdated. What we often talk about now is an issue network, and that just acknowledges the complexity of policymaking. Maybe the role that the media plays in that, maybe the role that a polling institution plays in that. So it is essentially an iron triangle, but more encompassing of maybe more than one interest group, or not just an interest group, a congressional committee, and a bureaucratic agency, but also maybe a university research agency, perhaps. Grassroots lobbying is reaching out to the people and then hoping that the people put pressure on government. A protest is a collected call for action, and civil disobedience is knowingly breaking a law that a person feels is unjust and accepting the punishment. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, which is one of our required documents, talks a lot about civil disobedience. Okay, next step is to go back into Schoology. There is something that looks like it's a quiz, but it's not a quiz. I'm just using that tool in Schoology, and you're going to share with me through that quiz any remaining questions that you have. And I am going to publish answers anonymously. I won't be anonymous, but your questions will be anonymous. I will publish answers to all of your questions this evening prior to 8 p.m. I will send out a remind text at 8 p.m. to remind you to take a look if you're interested in the answers to those questions. But answers to your questions will all be posted at between like 7:30 and 8 p.m. this evening. And unfortunately, I will be done answering emails after 8 p.m. because I gotta sleep, you know? Okay, if you need me, email me, and have a great day.